Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do a reaction to the shortlist for the Women's Prize for Fiction 2023. It was announced this morning as I am filming this, and I finally found some time in my day to sit down, go through these books, and give you my thoughts about each one and react properly. There was at least one surprise, one major surprise, for a book that did not make it onto the shortlist. I'll be talking about the books that didn't make it a little more toward the end. I want to start by going through the books that made it onto the shortlist and go from there. I will have a link to my original reaction video for the long list in the description box down below. I encourage you to check that out if you want to learn more information about these books. I'm going to use a Guardian article that was written by one of the judges, Rachel Joyce, to sort of highlight all of the books that made it onto the shortlist. But in my long list reaction, I went through every book that was on the long list and talked about what it was about. I used it as a sort of tool of discovery because some of the books had been completely unfamiliar to me at the time. And I talk a lot more about what each book is about. And you can check that out if you want more of that information, although there will be some of that here as well. And some of these books are now familiar to me. I had read two books on the long list, and both of those actually made it to the short list. So we will be talking about that. I have not managed to read any others from the long list yet, but there are at least two that I am hoping I will get to shortly. One of them actually didn't make it to the short list, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's start by running through the books that made it onto the short list. You know, generally, by and large, I think it was a strong long list, and I think that this shortlist has it's kept a lot of the books that seemed strong from the long list. I think there's at least one major surprise. However, the surprise is something I'm happy about. But let's dive in and talk about these books. The first shortlisted title is Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks. What Rachel Joyce says about it is, "We were blown away by Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks. A young black British woman growing up in 1970s London, Yamaye lives for the weekend when she goes clubbing and loses herself in music. There she meets Moose and finally feels on the edge of happiness until their relationship is brutally cut short and Yamaye begins a journey of self-discovery. Past and present collide with explosive consequences. Ambitious, imaginative, and singular, this novel is as relevant to today's racial climate as the 1970s, with dub music as a character in its own right. It's an electric story of love, violence, loss, and black womanhood." I haven't seen a whole lot of people read this book and react to it in my corner of BookTube, at least. But I know that there were a lot of people who were definitely excited about this book when the long list was announced. In fact, I was one of them. I had not heard of this book when the long list was announced, but the description of this book definitely made it stand out to me as something that I would be interested in reading it. I don't have immediate plans to read it, but it is something that I would be interested in. And I'm not altogether surprised that it made it onto the shortlist. It'll be interesting to see what happens when the winner is announced on June 14th, but it is still something that I'm interested in. Then we get to Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. Here's what Rachel Joyce says. Also set in the 70s, but this time in Belfast, Louise Kennedy's Trespasses sees a young Catholic woman fall in love with a Protestant married man. What makes it a quiet masterpiece is its utter conviction and evocation of emotion, time, and place, with unexpected moments of humor while it sweeps toward its inevitable conclusion. Even though you know where it is heading, the ending offers a moment of such clarity and unsentimental connection that we were all moved to tears. Devastating and beautiful, there is not one false note." That feels like a very strong blurb, which makes me think there's a good chance that Trespasses could end up being the winner, but we'll see. I was very interested in this one in particular, and I actually do have access to an audio copy, and ever since the long list was announced, I have been thinking about whether or not it will be my next audio. So this is definitely a book I'm interested in. I think Sean the Book Maniac just read this and loved it. So this is one that I think you could make a strong case for winning. It's definitely, of the shortlist titles that I have not read, it is the one that I am most interested in. And obviously whether or not I'm interested in reading it doesn't mean it has better or worse odds to win the prize, but that blurb seems very effusive. And I have heard good things about it from people who have read this since the Longlist was announced. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens on June 14th. Then we get to the first one that I had already read when the Longlist was announced. It's Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. Now, before I get to Rachel Joyce's blurb, I want to point out that this was my favorite read of 2022. I love it. I love it. I'll put a link to the video where Joel and I talk about our favorite reads of 2022 down below if you would like more about that. But yes, I am a huge fan of this book, so I was very happy to see it appear on the Women's Prize Longlist. In my heart would love this to win the Pulitzer Prize as well. And after my Longlist reaction, people pointed out that the Women's Prize could potentially be a complicating factor for whether or not Demon Copperhead is taken seriously for the Pulitzer Prize, because sometimes the Pulitzer doesn't like books that have fingerprints of other prizes on it. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with both. The Pulitzer will be announced on May 8th, which is obviously before the Women's Prize, but the fact that Demon Copperhead has now made it onto the shortlist, I wonder if that will be a complicating factor. I think there's potential that this will not end up winning because Barbara Kingsolver has already won a Women's Prize before, and so has another person on the shortlist as well. So there may be a desire to spread the wealth a little bit, which makes me think that if not for that, I would probably think that Demon Copperhead is the odds-on favorite for the Women's Prize. And I still think it really could be. If I were going to make a prediction right now, I would probably say Demon Copperhead. I don't know that the Women's Prize would care as much if Demon Copperhead does end up winning the Pulitzer. I'll put my Pulitzer Prize predictions video down below as well if you'd like to check that out, because again, my heart would vote for Demon Copperhead, but I gave my prediction to another book because my heart has not been good at predicting the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in recent years. So, but I'm regretting that. I feel like there's a good chance Demon Copperhead could win. But anyway, that's just an interesting book award conversation that is happening on the side of this discussion about the Women's Prize. And it will be interesting to see if there are two complicating factors here. Barbara Kingsolver could be in contention for the Pulitzer, but we don't have a long list or a short list for that. So that's all speculation at this point. So I feel like you have to put it to the side. But Barbara Kingsolver is a previous winner of this prize, and maybe that will factor into the judge's decision at some point. Here is what Rachel Joyce says. A complete blast of a reimagining of David Copperfield, Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead is about a young boy as he struggles to survive the U.S.'s opioid crisis. Demon is the boy no one wants. He braves foster care, child labor, athletic success, addiction, disastrous love, and a debilitating loss. And yet, caught within a plot that never pauses for breath, he is like a cork on water. He keeps bouncing back. Angry, robust, in equal parts funny and desolate. This is epic storytelling. Not one of us could talk about Demon without smacking a hand against our hearts. And I agree. It's such a good book. I would love to see this win a major literary prize. So hopefully at least one of these upcoming prizes will go Demon Copperhead's way. If not the Pulitzer, then the Women's Prize. If not the Women's Prize, the Pulitzer. Honestly, I'd like to see it both. So June 14th is the day that the Women's Prize will announce its winner. That is a special day for me because that is my birthday. And the only reason I'm bringing that up is that in my long list video, I planted my birthday wish on Demon Copperhead winning the Women's Prize. And even though people immediately pointed out to me that I could potentially be complicating the Pulitzer trajectory, or the Women's Prize could potentially complicate the Pulitzer trajectory of Demon Copperhead, I'm going to plant my birthday wish on this. Demon Copperhead should win both. I love this book that much. I would really love to see that happen. The next one is Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris. Here's what Rachel Joyce says. Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris is a lyrical, devastating, and timely love letter to war-torn Sarajevo. When fresh violence breaks out in the city, artist and teacher Zora sends her mother and husband to England for safety, believing she can continue her work. But as the city falls under siege, Zora and the people around her, most of whom she barely knows, find themselves cut off from their comforts, rights, and the outside world. There are moments of shocking brutality set against others of unexpected beauty and resilience. Exquisitely crafted, it pulses with tension. We couldn't stop turning the pages. This is another book that had really jumped out to me from the long list, and yet, like Fire Rush, I did not end up seeking it out, and I don't have immediate plans to pick it up. However, I am really interested. And I haven't heard too much about it, in my corner of BookTube, where people read it from the long list and talked about it too much. But I know a lot of people were interested in it based on my long list reaction video. And it feels like it would be a politically urgent book in this current time. So I wouldn't be surprised if Black Butterflies ends up winning it all. I feel like you could definitely make a case for every book on this shortlist, except for one, maybe. And maybe that comes down to the fact that I didn't really like The Marriage Portrait. I did a spoiler review of this book. I will link it in the description box down below if you would like to check that out, and if you're not worried about spoilers. So maybe I discount The Marriage Portrait outright because it was a disappointment to me. But I also feel like Maggie O'Farrell is the other person who is a previous winner of this prize. She won for Hamnet, which I absolutely love. I love Hamnet. I love it. I love it. I love it. But as much as I love Hamnet, I was disappointed by The Marriage Portrait. Here's what Rachel Joyce says, if you want a counter opinion to my own. Sumptuous, richly detailed, chilling, and ingenious, Maggie O'Farrell's The Marriage Portrait boldly reveals from the start that its 15-year-old protagonist is going to be murdered. Set against the male power and politics of Renaissance Italy, this is the story of Lucrezia, a young woman with spirit and intelligence who is forced into a marriage and refuses to be subdued by her husband, Alfonso, Duke of Ferrara. None of us could put this immaculate masterpiece down. I had problems with it, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into my problems with this book here, but to me, there were structural problems, there were story problems and narrative problems that I just couldn't reconcile. And I go into all of that in my review. So again, if you are not afraid of spoilers, or if you've already read this yourself, go check that out for my full thoughts on this book. So yeah, definitely I'm down on this book because it was a disappointment for me. But I also think that, Barbara Kingsolver won the Women's Prize a while ago for a very different book. And there are things about Demon Copperhead that make it extremely relevant and sort of urgent now, especially if they are considering, United States concerns like the opioid crisis that has ravaged this country. So it feels like there's a better case to make Barbara Kingsolver a two-time winner than there is for Maggie O'Farrell, who is, and again, I'm down on this book, but she's essentially doing the same thing that she did in Hamnet. So, and I feel like, looking back at the books we've already talked about, there's an urgency to Black Butterflies. There's an urgency to Trespasses. There's an urgency to Demon Copperhead. There's a unique angle for Fire Rush that could make it really urgent, and something that people want to reward and hold up. And I don't feel that way about The Marriage Portrait. And again, maybe that's because I'm down on this book. But I just feel like you can make much stronger cases for any other book on this shortlist than you would for The Marriage Portrait. This is definitely a book that I would swap out. I would take pretty much any book from the long list over this one in the shortlist, but that's me being cranky because I didn't like this book. Your mileage may vary. You may read this and you may love it. You may have read this and loved it. If you think I'm being cranky about this book because I didn't like it and it has better odds, please let me know. Make a case in the comment section down below. I would love to hear that. Now we get to the final book on the shortlist. Ia, the protagonist of Pod by Laline Paull, is a spinner dolphin who has always felt an outsider. When tragedy strikes, she makes the ultimate sacrifice, leaving her pod behind to confront a terrifying ocean she does not know. Visceral, urgent, haunting, like being swept through water, this novel explores themes of family, consciousness, solitude, belonging, and sacrifice. It is a bold, blistering book that confronts the environmental crisis head-on, and it's also a searing feat of imagination. We were in complete awe. Now, interestingly, This is one of the books from the long list that I did not immediately gravitate toward. This is one that I believe I was going to wait for feedback on because to me, the idea of a novel narrated by an animal is kind of interesting, but I would want some assurances about the quality. And, I'm hesitant about such things in general. Maybe that's because I lack a certain imagination. I don't know. But I was immediately hesitant about this book. A lot of people in the comments immediately gravitated toward it. So people had a very different reaction. And this actually is the book from the long list that I have seen people grab the most in my corner of booktube, at least. And the reaction has been very mixed, mostly negative. I think it's really interesting. But most of the people I've seen pick up Pod aggressively didn't like it. And there have only been a couple of people that were like, that's fine. I haven't seen anybody be effusive about it in any way. So the reaction that I'm seeing is very different from the one that the judges are clearly having. However, this is another book I think you could make a strong case for because it's all right there in what Rachel Joyce said. It confronts the environmental crisis head on, which is definitely something that any kind of jury or book prize would like to hold up. I mean, the Pulitzer Prize went to the Overstory not that long ago. It is clearly something that we need to care about and think about, and any book that deals with that could be a good conversation starter in that direction, but also just the fact that it's a searing feat of imagination. Last year, the Women's Prize went to Ruth Ozeki, and it went to the book that probably had the most imagination. And that feels like something the Women's Prize has been doing a fair amount lately. I believe it also went to Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. So and the jury changes every year, but there's definitely a sense that they are looking for exciting and imaginative fiction that also has a bit of a message to it. So I feel like I'm actually talking myself into the idea that Pod has a really strong chance at winning the Women's Prize for Fiction this year. But again, that's interesting because the reactions that I am seeing to it in my corner of BookTube are pretty negative and not very enthusiastic at all. But if you have read this book and liked it, I would love to hear from you in the comment section down below. Let me know what you thought of this book. So those are the shortlisted titles. Again, if I were going to plant my birthday wish on anything, I really want Demon Copperhead to win both the Pulitzer and the Women's Prize. Maybe that's greedy. I don't care. So the big surprise going from the long list to the short list is that there's no Glory by NoViolet Bulawayo. That did not make it to the short list. Now, there are a lot of reasons that could be. I've heard very mixed reactions to Glory. I have basically decided I am not going to read it. It is a book that has been in conversation for book prizes since it was released, basically. It was a finalist for the Booker Prize last year. So definitely it's a book that doesn't need award attention. If a judge or a jury were going to be thinking about such a thing, if they wanted to hold up a more unknown book or an unknown author, then definitely they would push toward Fire Rush or Trespasses or Black Butterflies or even Pod. So Glory may lose out in that regard, but it's interesting. It's been such a heavy hitter that as soon as it made it onto the long list, I admit I wasn't excited about that because I've decided I don't really want to read the book all that much. But it felt assured that it was going to be on the short list. If you had told me to pick the books that I would suspect to see, I would have said Demon Copperhead for sure. I'm not surprised The Marriage Portrait made it. So I would have said those two, but I would have included Glory. I would have said that those would be 3 books and then anything else is a wild card, and Glory is not there. So that is a big surprise. I'm not altogether sad to say goodbye to it. Again, being cranky about the fact that I've decided I don't want to read it. But, other people have read it and loved it. Doris from Aldi Books read it and loved it. So it's totally fine that it made it onto the long list. I'm just surprised that it didn't make it onto the short list. I had mentioned that there was another book from the long list that I have sort of had on deck to potentially read next, and that is The Bandit Queens. And that also did not make it onto the shortlist. I am a little sad. I'm not surprised. I was even commenting to someone over the weekend on a different video, and they had, we were talking about the Women's Prize, and I mentioned The Bandit Queens is a book that I want to read. However, I didn't think it was going to make it onto the shortlist. And sure enough, it hasn't. But I definitely still want to read it. And in fact, as I have been considering next books, I have been thinking about Trespasses and The Bandit Queens. And I actually feel like I might do The Bandit Queens before I would do Trespasses. Although now that Trespasses has made it onto the shortlist, maybe I will reverse that order. But those are the two books from the long list that I was most excited to read. And unfortunately, The Bandit Queens did not make it. I also had just heard really good feedback from a commenter whose name I don't know how to pronounce. I believe it is the initials of cats that they've had. So I apologize. If you're watching this video, I don't know how to pronounce your name. But we were just talking about Wandering Souls. That was a book that immediately jumped out to me from the long list, and I would like to read. I have not looked for a copy of it, but they did, and they were a little unsure of it in the beginning of the book. But when they finished it, they said it all came together really beautifully. And their comment had gotten me really excited about that book again, and unfortunately, it's not here among the shortlisted titles. We also say goodbye to Memphis, which was a book that seemed to be... I would not have been at all surprised if it had made the shortlist when it was announced. But immediately after the long list was announced, I started seeing comments on my video, but also in other places, and grumblings about how the author handles herself online. And it isn't great. It's really not great at all. So part of me does wonder if it was about the book or if it was more about the Women's Prize taking a step back from potential controversy, because, ooh, she is someone who engages with people who have read her book online and doesn't always handle those interactions well. And I can tell already a lot of people are going to be coming back and into the comment section and saying, well, this is supposed to be about the best book. Well, it's still not great when somebody doesn't handle themselves well. And I know that's a slippery slope. If you want to hold something against this one author, you need to start looking into, I don't know. I don't think you have to look into it. She's doing all of that publicly. So if people are talking about it publicly, that's fair game. But anyway, it did not make it onto the shortlist. And maybe that's for the best, because the discourse around that book online is difficult. It's sort of a minefield. Other books that we're saying goodbye to from the long list are Children of Paradise by Camilla Grudova. That was a book I was pretty unsure of. Cursed Bread by Sophie Mackintosh. I know a lot of people were really excited about that. The response I've seen is a bit, I don't want to say mixed. It's just, I haven't seen people read it and love it as much as they were looking forward to reading it, which is interesting. We also say goodbye to Homesick by Jennifer Croft, which had confused me because it was originally published as a memoir and then was republished as a novel, and all of that dynamic confused me. People did explain it, but another bullet dodged, because now we don't have to explain that anymore as we work through the announcement of the Women's Prize. I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel also did not make it. Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes did not make it. I know there were a lot of people who were really excited about Natalie Haynes when the long list was announced. I tend not to gravitate toward mythological retellings, so I feel like I don't want to say indifferent, but it could have gone either way and I would have been fine. And we already talked about Wandering Souls, The Dog of the North by Elizabeth McKenzie, which immediately turned me off with its description. So yeah, those are the books that did not make it. I am still really excited to read The Bandit Queens, but it did not make it onto the shortlist. Altogether, I think it's a strong shortlist. I personally would swap out The Marriage Portrait, and based on what I've heard about Pod, I would almost swap that out, but I haven't read it myself, so it's kind of hard to say, and I don't want to be just a hater on The Marriage Portrait, but to me, there seemed to be more interesting books on the long list than what I got out of The Marriage Portrait. That's all. It is what it is. I would love to hear your thoughts about this shortlist. I'd love to hear what you're rooting for. If there are any books that did not make it onto the shortlist that you are disappointed by, let me know all of that in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.